Hey, what's up guys, Cave Productions here. So Apple just announced their new MacBook Air and MacBook Pro 13-inch at WWDC 2022. While I didn't attend WWDC, like all of you, I still had the chance to learn about it online, either watching the keynote or reading about its specs afterwards. So here are my armchair general kind of thoughts about the new MacBook Air and MacBook Pro. So firstly, I don't think it was a secret that Apple was due to announce a new MacBook Air alongside their new M2 chip today at WWDC. So that's exactly what we got. We got the new redesigned 2022 MacBook Air as well as an updated 13-inch MacBook Pro. I will be mostly talking about the MacBook Air today, but I'll also talk a bit about the MacBook Pro later on. So firstly, let's talk about the new design of the new MacBook Air. So I kind of have a bit of mixed feelings about this. From a practical and functional point of view, this is definitely a welcome change over the old tapered shape and design of the MacBook Air. But from a form and aesthetic point of view, I'm a little sad as this officially marks the end of the iconic tapered shape of all MacBook Airs that came before it, and also in a way the end of the Steve Jobs era of design of MacBook Airs. The new MacBook Air essentially takes the design language of the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros and basically brings it down to a 13-inch form factor, which means that the overall shape is pretty similar. However, the new MacBook Air does spot some differences in terms of the exterior as compared to the Pros. For one, it has far fewer ports than the 14 and 16-inch Pros. The Air basically retains the same ports and layouts as the previous USB-C MacBook Airs, meaning a headphone jack on the right side, but now upgraded to support high impedance headphones and two Thunderbolt 4 ports on the left side. The only addition in ports this year is the addition of the MagSafe charging port, which is a welcome addition on the left side of the MacBook Air. There is, however, no third USB-C port, no HDMI port or SD card reader like the 14 and 16-inch Pros. When you open up the Air, you get a layout that is also practically identical to the 14 and 16-inch Pros as well. You now get a full-size function row in place of the thinner function row that you find on the older MacBooks, and you also get a new notched 13.6-inch display, which is up from 13.3 inches on the old Airs. Thankfully though, unlike some concept renders created which showed a white bezel, the new Air has black bezels, and white would have been very ugly, so good thing that Apple chose to go with black bezels. The only main difference in terms of design between the new Air and the 14 and 16-inch Pros is that the new keyboard is not blacked out, and the speaker grill has now been moved to the top instead of being at the sides like the old MacBook Airs. In terms of physical dimensions, the new 13-inch MacBook Air is only 1.13 centimeters thick, which is down from 1.61 centimeters of the thickest point of the previous MacBook Air designs, since it was a tapered design anyways. And it also weighs an incredible 1.24 kilograms, which is down from 1.29 kilograms of the previous Air. Overall, I welcome the new design of the Air as it is a move towards more function over form or practicality over aesthetic. What do I mean specifically by this? Well, as I explained, you can now add more ports due to the uniform thickness, although it is only one additional port. But the biggest downside of the tapered design to me was the fact that despite all of Apple's fancy engineering in battery technology, there was always kind of wasted space that could have been used for more battery. Apple literally had to engineer a terrace-style battery for the tapered design or risk leaving additional battery capacity on the table if they had just decided to stick to cuboid-shaped batteries. Now with the new uniform thickness design, it does mean that there is more room for batteries, and it has actually came to fruition. The new M2 MacBook Air now has a 52.6 Wh battery, up from 49.9 Wh. And the new M2 definitely is going to need that extra battery space, as the M2 is overall a more powerful chip that can also draw more power for its 10-core GPU. So great job to Apple for actually using the newfound space of the new uniform design for more battery capacity. So while I will miss the Steve Jobs era iconic MacBook Air design, the new MacBook Air is definitely a welcome change because it does bring some benefits from having that new design. Moving on from the design, the M2 MacBook Air also gets a new 13.6-inch display. As I mentioned, it is bigger than the M1 MacBook Air, but it also comes with that new notch, which I still feel is a little on the large end, But this whole new display assembly design, where it isn't tapered but rather a uniform thickness, also allows for a new 1080p HD camera in place of the old 720p one. So very nice on Apple for including that. Other specs for the display does include a new 500 nits of brightness, up from 400 nits of the older Air, and it now supports 1 billion colors over the unspecified millions of colors that the previous Air supported. There is no ProMotion though, so no 120Hz adaptive refresh rate. Lastly, I want to go over some of the new specs of the internals found in the M2 Air. So, as the name suggests, the new Air uses Apple's new M2 chip, which they once again used a very vague relative performance chart to show its gains over the older M1 and other vague competitors. To me, the biggest takeaway from the M2 chip is how it now starts at having an 8-core GPU as compared to a 7-core on the M1, and now has an upgraded 10-core GPU variant, which is up from the 8-core on the M1. So the base M2 MacBook Air and 13-inch Pro that you'll get will have an 8-core GPU, and you can upgrade it to a 10-core GPU if you want. The maximum amount of RAM has also been increased from 16GB of unified memory to 24GB of unified memory on the M2, which is an interesting amount of RAM, but every gigabyte does count. Also, the memory bandwidth has been increased to 100GB per second, up from 68.25GB per second on the M1, which is great as well. Essentially, if we're comparing the base M1 Air to the base M2 Air, you can expect a performance increase on the M2 Air across the board. Now let's talk about price. So this is honestly the most disappointing and a bit confusing thing about the new M2 Air, at least more so than the 13-inch Pro, but both are overall disappointing. Today, Apple has chosen to raise the starting price of the MacBook Air to $1199 from $999 or from 1,449 Singapore dollars to 1,699 Singapore dollars, which is a $200 more in the US and 250 more SGD here in Singapore. So the price hike here isn't as bad as in the US, but it's still pretty bad. Now, some of you would go, but Apple still has a $999 MacBook Air. Yeah, that is the old M1 MacBook Air and not the new M2 MacBook Air. Also, some of you might say, well, if the old Air is already worth $999, then doesn't it make sense for Apple to actually increase the price of the more powerful Air to $1199 since the old 8-core GPU Air was already $1249? So isn't that a good deal, because the new, more powerful M2 MacBook Air with an 8-core GPU is only $1199 as compared to the 8-core M1 GPU Air, which was $1249. Well, if you're looking at it from that perspective, then yeah, sure, but from my perspective, the whole reason for new tech is so that we can get more power at roughly the same price, not a whole $200 more. I mean, Apple themselves has been bringing the price of the MacBook Air down since 2018. Anyways, now that the rant is kind of out of the way, what do you get for the new prices? Well, at the new base price of $1199 or 1,699 Singapore dollars, you get the same amount of storage and memory as the base M1 from 2020, but just with the new 8-core GPU and 8-core CPU of the M2 chip. So 8GB of RAM and 256GB of storage. And for the more expensive $1,499 or 2,149 Singapore dollars model, you yet again get the same amount of RAM and storage as the more expensive M1, which is no longer available, but with the upgraded M2 with a 10-core GPU instead of the upgraded M1, which only had an 8-core GPU. So that is again 8GB of RAM and 512GB of storage. So overall, the new MacBook Airs are in line with the older M1 Airs, just with worse price tags. But one new addition with the upgraded Air or the 10-core GPU M2 Air, you do get Apple's new 35W charging brick, which has two USB-C ports instead of the single USB-C port 30W charging brick of the base M2 Air. But if you ask me, that is a pretty small addition, and I would rather just get a third-party charging brick with more USB-C ports and more wattage output. And now I want to bring in the 13-inch MacBook Pro, and this is where it gets even more confusing. So people who have already been on Apple's website to take a look at the new MacBooks might have been already confused by the new prices. Apple sells the new 13-inch Pro or the upgraded one at $1499, which is identical in price to the upgraded M2 Air. In Singapore, however, it's a little different. The upgraded M2 13-inch Pro is $2,179 as compared to $2,149 of the upgraded Air. So there is a $30 difference for some reason. But yeah, so the prices of both the upgraded M2 Air and the upgraded M2 13-inch Pro are either very similar or basically identical. In fact, the specs as well are very similar. Both of them rock the upgraded M2 chip with the 10-core GPU and 8GB of RAM and 512GB of storage. So why would you get the Air over the Pro, since the Pro supposedly and probably performs better than the new Air, simply because of the fact that the Pro retains a fan while the Air is fanless? Well, only you, the buyer, can answer that question yourself. You'll need to compare the two and see whether the new features on the Air, such as the new design, MagSafe, a bigger but notch display, full-size function keys, a 1080p camera, amongst other small things, are worth the removal of the fan, which means a decrease in performance, especially under heavier workloads for prolonged periods, in what is probably the last Steve Jobs era designed MacBook to ever be refreshed with new silicon. Alright, so before I end this video, I do have some last minute thoughts about some things that were missing from WWDC, and one thing that I found pretty funny. So I was a little disappointed when I found out that Apple didn't decide to refresh the Mac Mini with the M2 chip as well, as the Mac Mini would have no doubt been able to push the M2 chip to its limits and extract the most performance from it due to its beefier cooling solution. Well, at least that's what happened with the M1 Mac Mini, being the most powerful Mac of the M1 lineup due to its beefy cooling solution. So for those of you who are waiting out on a Mac Mini to get an M2 one, unfortunately you're out of luck. Also, another notable missing product is the Mac Pro. It's interesting that Apple has already moved on from the M1 chip, but there still hasn't been a new Mac Pro. This makes me kind of think that maybe Apple is developing a whole different kind of silicon for the Mac Pro, and not one that is M1 or M2 based, but one that is probably removable like other Intel and AMD desktop class chips. But no one really knows as of now, to be honest, so we can only wait and see. And lastly, let's talk about the thing that I found pretty funny at WWDC. So can we talk about how Apple continues to use the ugliest and borderline impossible non-Apple demo devices? I mean, they did this with Android, where they used some really ugly Android phone as their kind of like backdrop into Android. And now they decided to use a Windows laptop that looks like it came straight out of the early 2000s running Windows 11. To me, that's pretty hilarious because it kind of feels like Apple is trying to show people how much more advanced and beautiful looking their MacBooks are as compared to Windows laptops. When anyone who has ever seen a modern Windows laptop, even running Windows 10, would know that they look nothing like that. Well, except for, maybe super budget laptops. Anyways, that is all I want to say in this video. This was honestly just my first impressions, my 2 cents, kind of like an armchair general kind of impression of the new MacBook Air, since I don't think I'll be picking one up for myself, as tech is expensive. But yeah, I'm interested to see other reviews online, and maybe you should check them out too, about how the new M2 Air performs and the M2 13-inch Pro performs as well, to see whether you should pick one up for yourself. And again, anyways, that's it for this video. If you like this video, do give it a thumbs up. Please like and subscribe, as you really help this channel out. Please share this video as well if you found it useful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.